I checked my watch at exactly 8:14 a.m. We were 90 feet underground, screaming through the dark at 40 miles an hour, and the only thing on my mind was the coffee going cold in the cup holder next to the throttle. That's how the end of the world started for me. It didn't start with a bang or a broadcast or a mushroom cloud on the horizon. It started with a mundane Tuesday morning schedule and a thermos of lukewarm roast that tasted like burnt plastic. I've been an operator on the number 4 line for 12 years. You get a rhythm down here in the dark, a heartbeat that syncs up with the pulse of the city above. You learn the geography of the tunnels by the sway of the cab and the screech of the flange against the steel. You learn the sounds of the dark, the rhythmic thump-thump of the sleepers, the static hiss of the radio, the sudden pressure-popping rush of air when another train passes you on the express track. You learn to ignore the passengers, mostly. To us, to the guys in the front, they're just cargo. They are a sea of tired eyes, wet umbrellas, and glowing smartphone screens reflecting in the rearview mirror. They are weight. They are the variable that changes how long it takes to brake and how much juice you need to get moving again. You don't look at their faces. You look at the signals. Green over green, yellow over red. You watch the track, and you mind the gap. That morning, my train was packed tight, standing room only. We were a heavy steel worm burrowing through the bedrock, carrying 2,000 souls from the sprawling suburbs into the heart of the financial district. I was in the lead cab, a small, closet-sized box of buttons, levers, and monitors that smelled perpetually of ozone and industrial cleaner. The darkness of the tunnel whipped past the windshield like tracer fire, broken only by the rhythmic flash of the service lights mounted on the concrete walls. Flash, 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 hypnotic. If you let it, the tunnel can put you to sleep. That's why we have the dead man switch, a heavy spring-loaded handle you have to keep depressed at all times. If your hand slips, if you have a heart attack, if you fall asleep, the train screams to a halt. It's the ultimate failsafe. I had my left hand wrapped around it, feeling the vibration of the motors humming up through my arm, a connection between man and machine that I'd felt every workday for over a decade. We had just left Central Station, heading northbound. The run between Central and the Plaza is the longest stretch of uninterrupted tunnel in the system. 3 miles of black. No platforms, no exits, just deep-bore concrete tubes and the third rail humming with 600 volts of direct current. It's usually the quietest part of the shift, a time to just let the train run and watch the speedometer. But today, the radio was unusually chatty. Normally, the Rail Control Center, RCC, is a background drone. Dispatchers coordinating movements, maintenance crews calling in track inspections, the occasional report of a door malfunction. Professional, boring. But at 8:20, the tone changed. It wasn't what they were saying, it was how they were saying it. The dispatcher, a guy named Miller, who I'd known for years, sounded tight, breathless. He was barking orders, stepping on people's transmissions. Unit 22, hold at platform 4. Do not, I repeat, do not open your doors. We have a 1013 reported on the mezzanine level. A 1013, officer in distress. That happens. Usually a drunk taking a swing at a transit cop or a jumper resisting arrest. But then, 10 seconds later, another voice cut in. Control, this is station manager at West Side. We need medical. I've got multiple casualties here. They're biting each other. Send the police, send everyone. Copy, West Side. PD is en route. All units, hold positions. We are experiencing technical difficulties with the grid. Biting each other? I frowned. Looking at the handset like it had malfunctioned, I turned the volume up. The static was thick, heavy, like the air in the tunnel was charged with something bad. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a riot, maybe some new street drug was making people crazy. We'd seen it before with the bath salts years ago. People losing their minds, fighting 5 cops at once. That had to be it. Just a bad batch hitting the streets all at once. But the unease started to crawl up my spine, a cold sensation that settled in the base of my neck. I looked at the CCTV monitor on my console. It cycled through the feeds from the 8 cars behind me. Grainy black and white, low-resolution boxes showing the tops of people's heads. Car 1, directly behind me, was a solid mass of humanity. Suits, students, construction workers, tourists. They were swaying with the motion of the train, clutching the handrails, normal, boring. Then I saw the signal ahead. We were halfway through the long dark, a mile and a half from the nearest station in either direction. The signal mast mounted on the tunnel wall, usually a reassuring vertical green bar, snapped to red, a solid, unblinking crimson eye in the darkness. "Damn it," I muttered. Red meant stop. Absolute stop. There was a train ahead of us, or a track obstruction, or RCC had hit the panic button and frozen the entire system. Given the radio chatter, I guessed the latter. I eased back on the throttle, moving the master controller to the braking position. The train groaned, a metallic protest that shuddered through the floorboards. The pneumatic brakes hissed, biting into the wheels. We decelerated from 40 to 30, then 20, then 10. The darkness outside stopped blurring and solidified into damp concrete walls and thick black cables snaking along the conduit racks. We ground to a halt. The silence that followed was heavy. When the motors cut out, you realize just how loud the silence underground really is. It presses in on you. The air in the cab instantly felt hotter, thicker. I keyed the mic for the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are being held momentarily by the train dispatcher due to traffic ahead. We should be moving shortly. Please remain clear of the doors." I released the button. My voice had sounded calm, professional, the voice of authority. But my hand was sweating on the dead man's switch. I picked up the radio handset. "Control, this is train 404. I'm holding at signal marker 11, Bravo. What's the ETA on the hold?" Static. Then a burst of noise. Then Miller's voice. But he wasn't talking to me. He was shouting at someone in the control room. "Lock the doors. Lock the main doors. They're in the lobby. Oh God, look at the monitors. They're swarming the transmission cut out with a sharp electronic squeal. "Control?" I said. "Control, this is 404. Come in." Nothing. Just the low hum of the carrier wave. I sat there in the dim light of the cab, staring at the red signal ahead. My heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. They're in the lobby. Who? Terrorists? Shooters? The radio silence was worse than the screaming. In the absence of information, the mind fills the void with nightmares. I checked the tunnel ahead. Empty. Just the tracks disappearing into the gloom. Then, I heard it. It wasn't on the radio. It wasn't in the tunnel. It was right behind me. A sound came through the heavy, reinforced door that separated my cab from the passenger compartment of the first car. It was a sound I'd heard before in bar fights and bad accidents, but never this close. Never this raw. It was the sound of a chaotic struggle, the heavy thud of bodies hitting walls, the scuffling of shoes on the rubberized floor. And then, a scream. Not a shout of anger, not a "hey, watch it." This was a scream of pure, primal terror. A high-pitched shriek that shredded the air and made my teeth ache. It was a woman's scream, and it didn't taper off. It choked off. I spun around in my seat, my boots squeaking on the linoleum floor. There was a small window in the door, a square of safety glass about 6 inches by 6 inches, reinforced with wire mesh. I pressed my face close to it, cupping my hands around my eyes to cut the glare from the cab instruments. Car 1 was a war zone. The dense crowd I had seen on the monitor minutes ago had exploded outward, pressing violently against the walls and the sliding doors, leaving a circle of empty space in the middle of the car. It was like watching a drop of soap hit a greasy pan. The people were crushing each other, climbing over seats, trampling the fallen, desperate to get away from the center. In the middle of that circle, on the floor, 2 people were tangled together. One was a man in a gray business suit, mid-50s, balding. He was on his back, his arms flailing weakly. The other was a woman. She was wearing a nurse's scrub top, pastel blue with cartoon bears on it, now stained a deep, wet crimson. She was straddling the man, her knees pinned to his chest. Her head was buried in his neck. She was thrashing like a wild animal, jerking her head side to side with a violence that sprayed red mist into the air. I blinked, my brain refusing to process the data. She's biting him. That was the thought. But it didn't make sense. People don't bite people. Not like that. Not with that kind of mechanical ferocity. The man in the suit stopped struggling. His arms flopped down to the floor, wet and limp. The woman stopped thrashing. She sat up slowly, her movements stiff and jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. She turned her head. I was 3 feet away, separated only by the steel door and the wire mesh glass. I looked right into her face. I recoiled, slamming my back against the control console. Her face, it was ruined. Her mouth was a ragged maw of red, strings of flesh and gristle hanging from her teeth. Blood smeared her chin, her cheeks, her neck. But it was her eyes that froze the breath in my lungs. They were blown out, the pupils dilated so wide that the irises were just thin rings of color around black voids, and the whites of her eyes weren't white anymore. They were pink, shot through with ruptured capillaries, and her skin. Under the blood, her skin was the color of wet cement. Gray, dead. She looked at the window. She looked at me. There was no recognition in that stare. No humanity. It was the look of a shark investigating a vibration in the water. Cold, assessing, hungry, control. I grabbed the radio handset, screaming now, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. Control, I have a violent passenger. She just killed someone. I need police. I need help. Silence. The radio was dead. I looked back through the window. The nurse had lost interest in me. She lunged at the nearest person, a teenager with headphones around his neck, who was pressed against the glass partition near the seats. He didn't even have time to raise his hands. She tackled him, driving him into the plastic advertising panel. I heard the impact through the door. Wham! Then the screaming started again. The teenager shrieked as she tore at his face. The car erupted into absolute bedlam. The passengers were trapped. The doors were locked. The emergency release levers were pulled. I could see the red handles hanging down, but we were in a narrow tunnel. The sliding doors opened partially, revealing only the rough concrete of the tunnel wall inches away. There was nowhere to go. They were sealed in a steel tube with a monster. And then, the impossible happened. The man in the suit. The one on the floor. The one whose throat had been ripped out 30 seconds ago. He moved. It wasn't a groan of pain. It was a spasm. His body arched off the floor, his back bowing like he'd been hit with a taser. Then he flopped back down. Then he did it again. He rolled over. He pushed himself up. I watched, paralyzed, as a dead man stood up. He swayed on his feet. Blood poured down the front of his white shirt, soaking his tie. His head lolled to the side, the wound in his neck gaping open, exposing anatomy that should have been hidden. By all rights, his blood pressure should have been 0. He should have been a corpse, but he wasn't. He lifted his head. His eyes snapped open. They were the same. Black pupils, milky pink-shot whites, the dead gray pallor. He turned to the woman standing next to him, a lady in a heavy winter coat who was screaming and pounding on the window of the sliding door. The dead man reached out, grabbed her hair, and pulled her head back. She screamed, "No, no, please." He buried his face in her shoulder. I saw the fabric of her coat tear. I saw the blood spray. It was spreading. It wasn't just a riot. It was a chain reaction. I scrambled for the door lock on my side, checking the deadbolt. It was engaged. I checked it again. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely feel the metal latch. I was safe in the cab. The door was reinforced. It was designed to stop a bullet. It could stop them. But I was stuck. The train was dead in the water. The signal was red. I looked at the CCTV monitor. The feed from Car 2 showed the panic spilling over. People were crushing through the gangway door, climbing over each other to escape Car 1. But as they ran, they brought it with them. I saw a man fall, tackling a woman. I saw people biting, clawing, tearing. It was like watching a virus multiply under a microscope. But the virus was people. The screaming from Car 1 changed pitch. It stopped being the scream of people fighting. It became the scream of people dying. Wet, gurgling cries that were cut short. Then, the pounding started on my door. Thud, thud, thud. I spun around. The teenager. The kid with the headphones. He was pressed against the glass of my cab door. His face was a ruin. One cheek was gone, hanging in a flap of skin, revealing the teeth and jawbone beneath. His nose was broken, flattened against the glass. He was smearing blood all over the window as he hammered on it with his fists. His eyes were locked on mine. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't begging to be led into safety. He was snapping his teeth. Click-clack, click-clack. He was trying to eat the glass to get to me. "Get back," I yelled. backing away until I hit the windshield of the train. "Get back!" He didn't hear me. Or he didn't care. He just kept pounding. Thud. Thud. Crunch. The wire mesh in the safety glass started to warp. I looked around the cab for a weapon. My bag? A thermos? The fire extinguisher. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from its bracket on the wall. It was heavy, red, solid steel. I held it to my chest, my breathing coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. "Think, Elias, think," I whispered to myself. I couldn't stay here. If they broke through the door, I was dead. There was no room to fight in the cab. It was a coffin. I looked at the controls. The radio was dead. The train was disabled by the signal interlock system. I couldn't move the train forward without RCC overriding the red light, and RCC sounded like they were already dead. I had to leave the train. I looked out the front windshield. The tunnel stretched out ahead, bathed in the eerie yellow glow of the service lights. There was a catwalk on the right side, the emergency walkway. It was narrow, barely 2 feet wide, running along the wall. If I opened the cab door to the catwalk, I could run. But run where? To the next station? If this was happening here, was it happening there? Thud. A spiderweb crack appeared in the center of the safety glass on the door behind me. The teenager was joined by the nurse. She was pushing him, clawing at the frame, trying to get her fingers into the gap. I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the clip on the dash. I grabbed the reverser key, a heavy brass handle used to activate the control stand. It was a solid chunk of metal, improvised brass knuckles. I put my hand on the door release button for the exterior cab door. "Okay," I breathed. "Okay." I looked at the CCTV monitor one last time. Car 1 was quiet now. The screaming had stopped. The floor was covered in bodies. But they weren't lying still. They were twitching, jerking, standing up. A dozen of them. 2 dozen. They were all looking at the front of the train. They were all looking at the cab door. The teenager outside my door let out a Mona sound that vibrated through the steel. It was a hungry sound, a summoning sound. The glass cracked again. A piece of it fell onto the cab floor. A gray finger poked through the hole, wiggling, searching for the lock. I hit the door release button. Hiss. The hydraulic seal on the exterior door broke. The door slid open into the darkness of the tunnel. The smell hit me instantly, not the sterile ozone of the cab, but the smell of the tunnel. Damp earth, grease, rat droppings, and blood. The air coming from the vents of the passenger cars was thick with the copper tang of it. I stepped out onto the narrow catwalk. The train was a long, silver beast, stretching back into the dark. The windows of the passenger cars were lit from the inside. It looked like a terrarium of horrors. I could see them. I could see the passengers, the infected, throwing themselves against the windows as they saw me move. They were smearing the glass with red and black fluids, their mouths opening and closing, their hands clawing at the panes. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel. The beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating the tracks, the cables, the trash. "Is anyone out there?" I yelled. My voice echoed, bouncing off the curved walls. "Hello?" Silence, just the hum of the third rail. Then, a sound from further down the train. Smash. Glass breaking. I looked back. About 3 cars down, a window shattered outward. A body tumbled out of the train and landed on the catwalk. Then another, then a third. People? Survivors? "Hey!" I shouted, waving the light. "Hey! Up here." The figures stood up. They were silhouetted by the light from the train windows. They turned toward me. Even at this distance, 50 yards away, I could tell. They moved wrong. They didn't stand up like people in pain. They stood up like puppets being yanked by strings. One of them let out a shriek, the same shriek the nurse had made. Then they started running. They were running along the catwalk toward me, sprinting, not shambling like movie zombies. They were sprinting with terrifying athletic speed, jumping over conduits, their arms pumping. "Oh God," I whispered. I turned and ran. I ran into the dark, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly on the sleepers and the rails. I ran away from my train, away from the passengers I was supposed to protect, away from the life I had known 10 minutes ago. I ran because the red signal wasn't just a traffic delay anymore. It was the end of the line. The tunnel ahead was pitch black, a throat waiting to swallow me whole. I didn't know what was waiting in the darkness. I didn't know if the next station was a sanctuary or a slaughterhouse. All I knew was the sound of footsteps behind me, slapping against the concrete, fast, relentless, gaining. I gripped the brass reverser key in my fist until my hand cramped. "Wake up," I hissed to myself, my boots pounding the grate. "Wake up, Elias." But the smell of blood was too real. The sound of the screaming was too loud. This wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday, and I was alone in the dark with the things that used to be my passengers. I saw a service ladder ahead, leading up to a ventilation grate. A way out. I sprinted for it, my lungs burning, the footsteps behind me getting louder, closer, accompanied now by the wet, clicking sound of teeth snapping together in anticipation. I reached the ladder and scrambled up, my flashlight clamped in my teeth. I risked a glance down. The beam of light swept over the face of the first pursuer. It was a man in a construction vest. His jaw was hanging by a tendon. He looked up at me, his eyes glowing white in the harsh LED light, and he smiled. A ruin of a smile. He leaped for the ladder. I kicked down, my boot connecting with a wet crunch, and scrambled upward into the shaft, pulling the grate shut beneath me, just as his fingers clawed through the mesh. I lay there on the cold metal grating, gasping for air, staring down into the tunnel. Below me, they gathered. 5 of them, 10. Looking up, moaning, waiting. I rolled onto my back and looked up at the sliver of daylight coming from the street level, 20 feet above. I could hear sirens, hundreds of them, a cacophony of wailing that sounded like the city itself was screaming. I wasn't safe. I was just trapped in a different box. I keyed my radio one last time, whispering into the dead air. "Control, this is train 404. I've abandoned the train. I repeat, I have abandoned the train. God help us." I clipped the radio to my belt, gripped my makeshift weapon, and started climbing toward the daylight, toward the fire, toward the end of the world. The metal rungs of the ladder were slick with condensation and grime, vibrating against my palms with the force of the chaos erupting above and below. I climbed until my lungs burned, counting the bars to keep my mind from snapping. 1, 2, 3. Don't look down. If I looked down, I would see the grate I had just slammed shut. I would see the white, dead eyes of the construction worker staring up at me, his fingers hooked through the mesh, pulling, testing the metal. I could hear them down there, a wet, collective moaning that echoed up the concrete throat of the ventilation shaft, amplified by the acoustics of the tunnel. It sounded like the wind, if the wind had a voice and was hungry. Above me, the square of daylight grew brighter, but it wasn't the clean, welcoming light of a morning sun. It was hazy, choked with particles. The air growing thicker as I ascended didn't smell like fresh city air. It smelled of burning rubber, unburnt gasoline, and that sharp, coppery tang I had smelled in the tunnel, blood. It was faint here, mixed with the exhaust, but it was there. My operator's nose, tuned to the scent of overheating brakes and ozone, picked it out instantly. I reached the top. The heavy iron grate covering the sidewalk access was locked, but from the inside, it was just a gravity latch. I pushed. It was heavy, solid cast iron designed to withstand the weight of foot traffic. I gritted my teeth, braced my shoulder against the cold metal, and shoved upward with my legs. The grate groaned, rusted hinges shrieking in protest, and flopped open onto the concrete with a deafening clang. I pulled myself up, scrambling out of the hole like a rat fleeing a flooded cellar. I rolled onto the pavement, gasping, clutching the brass reverser key so hard my knuckles were white. I expected to be tackled. I expected a police officer to yell at me to get down. I expected something, but nobody looked at me. I was in an alleyway off 14th Street, a narrow service corridor lined with dumpsters and the back doors of restaurants. And it was bedlam. The sound hit me first. In the shaft, it had been a muffled roar. Up here, it was a physical assault. Sirens. Not just one or two, but a continuous, overlapping wall of wailing. Police cruisers, fire trucks, ambulances, every emergency vehicle in the city seemed to be screaming at once. Beneath that was the sound of horns. A relentless, aggressive blare of car horns that didn't stop. A singular note of frustration and panic rising from the street. And under that, the screaming. Thousands of voices. I stood up, my legs trembling. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the tunnel was starting to curdle into a cold, shaking shock. I dusted off my uniform trousers, a ridiculous automatic gesture of normalcy. "Look professional, Elias. You're a transit authority employee." I walked to the mouth of the alley. The street was a parking lot. 4 lanes of traffic were deadlocked, bumper to bumper. Cars were skewed at odd angles, some up on the curb, others scraped against each other. Drivers were standing by their vehicles, shouting, gesturing. Some were sitting inside with the windows up, staring straight ahead. It looked like the worst gridlock I'd ever seen, magnified by a factor of 10. But then, I saw the smoke. 3 blocks down, a column of black, oily smoke punched into the gray sky. A bus was on fire. I could see the flames licking out of the shattered windows, curling up the side of the building next to it. People were running past the intersection, a chaotic stream of pedestrians sprinting down the middle of the street, weaving between the stalled cars. They weren't running to something. They were running away from the smoke. "Hey!" I shouted at a man running past the alley. He was wearing a delivery uniform, clutching a box to his chest. "Hey, what's happening? Is it a bomb?" He didn't even turn his head. He just kept running, his eyes wide and fixed on the horizon, bumping into me hard enough to spin me around. He didn't apologize. He didn't stop. He just vanished into the crowd. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. My radio crackled on my hip, a burst of static that made me jump. I grabbed it, desperation clawing at my throat. "Control? This is 404. I am topside. I am at 14th and Broadway. Do you copy?" Static. Then, a voice. Not Miller. Not dispatch. It sounded like a recording, looping over and over, faint and distorted. "Remain indoors. Do not contact with fluids. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Remain indoors." The signal died. I looked at the stalled cars next to me. A silver sedan. A woman was behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her skin looked like wax. She was staring at her phone. I tapped on the glass. Ma'am, you need to unlock the door. It's not safe." She looked up at me. She was crying, silent, streaming tears. She held up her phone to the window. I leaned in. On the screen was a news feed. The headline was in bold red letters, * state of emergency declared. Riots reported citywide. Hospitals locked down. Below it, a video played. It was shaky footage, maybe from a helicopter. It showed a crowd of people swarming a police barricade, but they weren't throwing rocks. They were throwing themselves. They were tackling the officers, dragging them down. The camera zoomed in. I saw the gray skin. I saw the biting. The woman mouthed something to me through the glass. "My kids." Before I could answer, a gunshot cracked the air. It was close enough that I felt the pressure wave in my chest. I spun around. 50 yards away, near the entrance to the subway station I would have arrived at if the world hadn't ended, a police cruiser was parked sideways across the lanes. A cop stood behind the open door, his weapon drawn. He was screaming at someone. "Get back! Stay back!" I said, "Get down." I started moving toward him. He was authority. He was a gun. He was safety. "Officer," I waved my hands. "Officer, I'm a train operator. There's something in the tunnels. You have to seal the station." He didn't hear me. He was focused on a figure stumbling toward him from the subway entrance. It was a woman. She was limping, one leg dragging behind her like a dead weight. Her clothes were torn. She was covered in soot and grime. To the casual observer, she looked like a victim of the fire down the street. But I knew that walk. I knew that jerky marionette movement. "Ma'am, get on the ground," the cop screamed. His voice cracked. He was terrified. The woman lifted her head. Even from here, I saw the gray pallor. I saw the black veins spider-webbing up her neck. She let out a sound, that high-pitched shriek that I had heard in the train car. It cut through the noise of the traffic like a razor blade. She lunged. She covered the 10 feet between them in a blur of motion that shouldn't have been possible with a dragged leg. The cop fired. Pop. Pop. 2 shots. Center mass. I saw the puffs of dust on her jacket where the bullets hit. She didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. She hit him with the force of a linebacker. driving him back against the cruiser. They went down in a tangle of limbs. "No!" I shouted, freezing in my tracks. The cop screamed. It was a wet, gurgling scream that bubbled up and then stopped abruptly. The woman, the thing, jerked her head back, ripping something away. The crowd around them, the drivers in the cars, the pedestrians, they froze. For a heartbeat, the entire intersection held its breath. We were witnessing the impossible. We were watching the rules of reality break. Then the panic broke. It was instantaneous. A collective realization that safety was an illusion. The drivers in the front row, the ones closest to the cruiser, abandoned their cars. They threw open their doors and ran. The pedestrians stampeded. People were knocked down, trampled. I saw a man in a suit get shoved into the side of a bus, saw him fall, saw the crowd surge over him without pausing. But the real horror wasn't the stampede. It was what was coming up the stairs. Behind the police cruiser, the subway entrance, the wide concrete stairs leading down to the mezzanine, was dark. But now, movement rippled in that darkness. They poured out. It wasn't a few. It wasn't a dozen. It was a flood. They scrambled up the stairs on hands and feet, climbing over each other like insects escaping a flooded nest. Gray skin, torn clothes, blood-soaked mouths. They spilled out onto the sidewalk, blinking in the daylight, sniffing the air. I saw transit workers in orange vests. I saw businessmen. I saw tourists with cameras still strapped around their necks. But they were all the same now. They were a single organism, a hive mind driven by hunger. They hit the crowd like a wave crashing into a sandcastle. I watched a bike messenger try to pedal away, only to be tackled by 3 of them. They dragged him off the bike and tore into him right there on the asphalt. I watched a woman trying to get her baby out of a car seat in the back of a stopped SUV. An infected man shattered the rear window with his head, just rammed his skull through the glass and dove inside. The car rocked violently. The woman screamed, then silence. I backed away. My feet felt heavy, clumsy, like I was moving through deep water. "Run, Elias, move." But my brain was stuck on the math, the sheer numbers. If that many came out of one station, how many were in the city? There are 472 stations in the system, millions of riders. If the infection traveled the lines, if it moved as fast as my train, the city was already dead. We just hadn't stopped twitching yet. "Hey, watch it!" A man slammed into me, knocking the brass key from my hand. It clattered to the pavement. I scrambled to pick it up, my fingers scraping against the rough asphalt. When I looked up, I saw him. He was standing 10 feet away, staring at me. He was wearing a deli apron, white stained with mustard and grease, but his chin was wet with something darker. He was swaying, his head cocked to the side like a dog listening to a whistle I couldn't hear. He hissed. I scrambled backward, crab walking on my hands and feet. "Stay back!" I yelled, brandishing the brass bar. He didn't care about the bar. He launched himself at me. I rolled to the side. He hit the pavement where I had been a second ago, his teeth snapping on the air. He scrambled to turn around, his movements jerky and unnatural. I didn't wait for him to reset. I swung the reverser key. It was a heavy piece of solid brass, 3 pounds of industrial metal. I brought it down on the back of his head. Crunch. It felt sickening. Wet. The vibration traveled up my arm. He collapsed. He didn't twitch. He didn't groan. He just stopped. I stood over him, panting, staring at what I had done. I had just killed a man. A deli worker. Maybe he had kids. Maybe he was just sick. Then I saw the bite on his neck. A chunk of flesh missing the size of an apple. The black veins radiating out from it. He wasn't a man. Not anymore. "Move," I whispered. "Move or die." I turned and ran. I didn't stick to the sidewalk. It was too crowded. I jumped onto the hood of a yellow taxi, the metal denting under my boots. I ran across the roofs of the gridlocked cars, hood to trunk, trunk to hood. It was a sea of metal islands. Inside the cars, faces looked up at me. Terrified faces, angry faces. Some were honking at me, others were screaming for help. "Open the door, let me in," a man shouted, banging on his sunroof. I ignored him. I couldn't help him. If I stopped, I died. I reached the roof of a delivery van and paused, looking for high ground. The street level was a kill box. The infected were weaving through the cars, pulling people out. The panic was creating bottlenecks where the crowd was crushing itself against buildings. I needed to get up. To my left, an old brick building had a fire escape ladder retracted about 10 feet above the ground. I jumped from the van to the top of a newsstand kiosk, the plastic roof buckling under my weight. From there, I leaped for the ladder. My fingers hooked the bottom rung. The rust bit into my skin. I pulled. The counterweight mechanism groaned, and the ladder slid down with a screech of metal on metal. I scrambled up. Below me, hands grabbed at the ladder. Not infected hands. Human hands. Help me. Pull me up. A woman in a business suit was reaching up, her face twisted in desperation. Behind her, the crowd was surging. Climb, I shouted down at her. Just climb. She grabbed the rungs and started up. Behind her, a man grabbed her ankle, trying to pull her down so he could take her place. Let go, she screamed, kicking at him. Her heel caught him in the eye. He howled and let go. She climbed up past me, sobbing, collapsing on the metal grating of the first landing. I followed her up, pulling the retractable ladder back up as best I could, jamming it halfway so it hung out of reach. We were 20 feet up, safe. For the moment, I leaned against a brick wall, my chest heaving, watching the nightmare unfold below. From this vantage point, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The intersection of 14th and Broadway was a slaughterhouse. The infected were moving like a pack of wolves, cutting off escape routes, swarming isolated groups. I saw them drag a mounted police officer off his horse. The horse kicked and trampled, crushing skulls, but they swarmed it too. In seconds, the animal disappeared under a pile of gray bodies. The sound was the worst part. The continuous, agonizing scream of a city being eaten alive. My phone, the woman next to me gasped. She was fumbling with her purse, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her lipstick. Her keys, a pack of gum. They fell through the grate to the alley below. My phone doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? The networks are overloaded, I said, my voice sounding distant, hollow. Everyone is calling at once. I have to call my husband. He's at the plaza. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wet. Is it everywhere? Is it just here? I looked north, toward the plaza, toward the financial district. Smoke columns were rising from uptown. Thick, black pillars marking the skyline. I counted 4, 5, no, 6. It's everywhere, I said. And then, the sirens changed pitch. It wasn't the wail of police cruisers anymore. It was a deeper, more resonant sound. A mechanical warble that echoed off the skyscrapers. I looked up. Low over the rooftops, a helicopter roared past. It was a police chopper, blue and white. It was flying erratically, banking hard, too low. Smoke was trailing from its tail rotor. Watch out! I grabbed the woman and pulled her flat against the grating. The helicopter spun. It clipped the edge of a glass office tower across the street. The sound of the impact was like a bomb going off. Glass shattered, raining down like diamonds. The helicopter lost its tail. It spiraled down, spinning wildly, and crashed into the middle of the gridlocked intersection below. The explosion blew the windows out of the building we were attached to. A wave of heat washed over us, singing my eyebrows. A fireball mushroomed up from the street, engulfing cars, people, infected. For a second, the screaming stopped, replaced by the roar of the fire. Then it started again, louder. I coughed, waving smoke away from my face. I looked over the railing. The intersection was a crater of burning jet fuel and twisted metal. The fire was spreading fast, fed by the gasoline in the stalled cars. But the infected, they didn't run from the fire. I saw them on the periphery of the flames. Some of them were burning. Their clothes were on fire. Their hair was gone, but they kept moving. They kept attacking. I watched a burning man, a literal human torch, tackle a firefighter who was trying to deploy a hose. The burning thing bit the firefighter through his turnout coat. They rolled on the ground, the fire spreading to the firefighter's gear. They didn't feel pain. They didn't fear death. We can't stay here, I said. The heat was already becoming intense. The smoke was thick, acrid, choking. The fire is going to spread to this building. The woman was curled in a ball, rocking back and forth. I can't move, I can't. You have to, I said. I grabbed her arm and hauled her up. She was dead weight. What's your name? Sarah, she whispered. Sarah, I'm Elias. We are going to climb to the roof. The smoke will be thinner up there. We can see where to go. Okay? She nodded, but her eyes were vacant. She was going into shock. Climb, I ordered. We scrambled up the fire escape. 3rd floor, 4th floor. The sounds of the street grew slightly dimmer, but the smell of the burning city grew stronger. We reached the roof access of the 6-story tenement. I vaulted over the parapet onto the tar paper roof. I pulled Sarah over behind me. We collapsed on the gravel surface, coughing. I stood up and walked to the edge of the roof, looking out over the city. It was a vista of hell. To the south, the bridges were jammed solid. I could see the glint of thousands of windshields reflecting the sun. Nothing was moving. To the west, the river was dotted with boats, ferries, private yachts, tugs. They were swarming away from the island. But it was the streets below that held my gaze. The infection was spreading like ink in water. I could trace the lines of panic. Wherever the crowd ran, the gray shapes followed. It wasn't random. It was a hunt. A massive, coordinated consumption of the population. And the noise, it wasn't just sirens anymore. I heard the dull thump 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 of heavy rotors. Military. I looked east. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were cutting across the skyline, heading toward the hospital district. They weren't landing. They were circling. Then, I saw the flashes from the door gunners. Tracers zipped down from the choppers, stitching lines of dust and destruction across the streets. They were firing into the crowds. They're shooting, Sarah said, standing beside me. They're helping us. I watched the tracers. They weren't picking off targets. They were suppressing the street. They were firing at everything that moved. They aren't helping, I said grimly. They're containing, my radio chirped, a clear, piercing tone that cut through the static. It was the emergency override signal, the one that wakes up every handset in the system, regardless of the channel. I unclipped it, holding it to my ear. All transit personnel, a voice said. It was calm. Terrifyingly calm. This is Central Command. The containment protocols have failed. The system is compromised. All stations are to be considered hostile. If you are underground, get out. If you are on the surface, find shelter. Do not approach the designated safe zones. I repeat, do not approach the safe zones. They have been breached. Good luck. The transmission clicked off. I looked at Sarah. She was looking at the helicopters, hope fading from her face. Where do we go? She asked. I looked at the burning intersection below. I looked at the subway entrance, vomiting more monsters into the daylight. I looked at the military firing on civilians. I realized then that the math had changed. It wasn't about getting home anymore. It wasn't about waiting for rescue. We need to get off the island, I said. The tunnels are death traps. The bridges are parking lots. The water? She asked. Maybe, I said. But then I looked at the roof access door of the building next to us. It was open. A figure stepped out. It was a man in a tattered suit. He was missing an arm. The sleeve of his jacket flapped loosely, soaked in blood. He looked across the gap between the buildings. Maybe 8 feet. He saw us. He let out a moan. Behind him, 3 more figures stepped out. Then, 5. They had cleared the building. They were moving roof to roof. They can climb, I whispered. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Walls didn't matter. Height didn't matter. The one-armed man stepped back, gauging the distance. He ran. He leaped. He cleared the gap, landing on our roof with a heavy roll. He sprang up instantly, snarling. "Run!" I shouted at Sarah. We sprinted across the roof toward the north side. There was no fire escape there. Just a drop to the alley. The infected man was fast. I could hear his feet crunching on the gravel behind us. I saw a water tower structure ahead, a steel ladder leading up to the tank. "Up!" I shoved Sarah toward it. She scrambled up the ladder. I was right behind her. I felt a hand grab my boot. I kicked back, hard. My heel connected with a face. I felt the nose cartilage give way. The grip loosened. I pulled myself up onto the narrow walkway surrounding the water tank. I looked down. The one-armed man was at the bottom of the ladder, staring up at me. His face was caved in from my kick, but he was smiling. His teeth were black with rot. He started to climb. He didn't care about his missing arm. He hooked his elbow over the rung, pulled himself up, hooked his legs. He was slow, clumsy, but relentless. And behind him, the others were jumping the gap. One missed, falling 6 stories to the alley with a wet smack that I felt in the soles of my feet. But 4 more made it. They gathered at the bottom of the ladder. We were trapped on top of a water tower, 6 stories up, with a city burning around us and a pack of monsters climbing toward us. I looked at the brass key in my hand. It seemed so small now. I looked at Sarah. She was huddled against the tank, shaking. "Don't look down," I told her, stepping to the top of the ladder to block the way. "Just don't look down." I raised the brass bar. The one-armed man reached the top rung. He lunged. I swung, and as the metal connected with bone, I realized the sun was high in the sky. It was barely noon. The first day hadn't even ended, and we were already out of places to run. The brass reverser key connected with the side of the one-armed man's skull with a sound like a hammer striking a wet sandbag. It wasn't a clean, metallic clink. It was a dull, dense thud that vibrated all the way down my forearm to the elbow. The impact didn't just break the bone, it caved it in. The force of the swing, combined with his upward momentum, twisted his neck at an angle that would have severed the spinal cord of a living man instantly. He didn't scream. He didn't flail. The lights just went out behind those milky, dead eyes. His grip on the ladder rung loosened, his fingers uncurling like dead spiders. He fell backward, his single arm tracing a lazy arc in the air. He collided with the infected woman climbing directly beneath him. The impact knocked her loose, and she fell into the man below her. It was a domino effect of gray flesh and tattered clothes. I watched them tumble, a knot of snapping jaws and flailing limbs, plummeting 6 stories down to the alleyway below. They hit the pavement with a collective wet smash that sounded like a garbage truck dropping a load of spoiled meat. I didn't look to see if they got up. I didn't care. "Climb," I rasped, my voice sounding like it was coming from someone else. "Sarah, get on the walkway." I hauled her up onto the narrow steel grating that circled the water tank. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, a rapid-fire clicking sound that cut through the distant wail of the city. We were 90 feet in the air, perched on a rusted steel halo above a dying world. The wind was stronger up here. It whipped my uniform shirt against my skin and carried the thick, oily smoke from the burning intersection into our faces. I collapsed against the curved wood of the water tank, sliding down until I was sitting on the grate. I looked at the brass key in my hand. It was dented. There was a smear of black blood and gray matter caught in the groove of the handle. I wiped it on my pant leg, staring at the stain it left behind. "Did you kill him?" Sarah asked. She was huddled opposite me, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked small, fragile, like a piece of porcelain that had already been dropped and glued back together. "He was already dead," I said. The words tasted like hash. I just stopped him from moving. I forced myself to stand up. I needed to assess the situation. I needed to think like an operator. Assess the line, check the signals, determine the right of way. I walked to the railing and looked out. From this height, the geography of the collapse was laid out like a transit map. The grid of Manhattan, usually a rigid system of order and flow, had become a chaotic tapestry of fire and gridlock. To the north, Times Square was invisible behind a wall of smoke. To the south, the financial district was a cluster of sparkling towers rising out of a haze of dust. But it was the streets immediately below us that held the true horror. The infection wasn't just a riot anymore. It was a tide. I could see the patterns of movement. The gray masses were flowing through the avenues like water finding the path of least resistance. They were swarming around stalled cars, flooding into building lobbies, chasing the pockets of running civilians into dead ends. It was predatory. It was efficient. "Look at the bridges," I whispered. I turned my gaze to the East River. The Williamsburg Bridge was a parking lot. Sunlight glinted off thousands of stationary cars. But at the Manhattan side entrance, I saw flashes, explosions, small, rhythmic detonations. "They're sealing it," I said. "They aren't letting anyone leave." Sarah pulled herself up to the railing, her face pale. "What? Who?" "The military, the police, whoever is left," I pointed toward the river. "Look at the water, the ferries are turning back." She squinted against the smoke. "Why would they do that? We're trapped here." "Containment," I said. The word felt heavy, clinical. "They've done the math. The island is compromised. If they let us out, We bring the infection with us. So, they locked the doors. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the wind. I was a transit worker. I knew about containment protocols. If a train has a fire, you isolate the car. If a station has a gas leak, you seal the entrances. You sacrifice the few to save the system. We were the few. "We need to move," I said, turning away from the view. "We can't stay on this tower. It's a dead end. Eventually they'll figure out how to climb up here, where the fire from the intersection will spread to this building." "Where do we go?" Sarah asked. "You said the bridges are closed. We go to the water," I said. "The west side, the Hudson. Maybe there are private boats. Maybe the blockade isn't as tight on the Jersey side. It's our only chance." That's across the city," Sarah stammered. "We have to cross the avenues. We stay high," I said, looking at the landscape of rooftops. "We move roof to roof as far as we can. We only go down when we have to." I checked the ladder one last time. The alley below was empty of movement, just a pile of broken bodies. I gripped the reverser key and nodded to Sarah. "Let's go." We climbed down from the water tank onto the roof of the tenement. The tar paper was soft under our feet, heated by the midday sun. We moved north, away from the burning intersection of 14th Street. The roofs in this part of the city were a patchwork of heights: 6-story tenements, 4-story brownstones, the occasional 10-story office building jutting up like a cliff. We reached the edge of our roof. The next building was a brick walk-up, about 5 feet lower and 4 feet away. A manageable jump for me, a terrifying one for Sarah. "I can't," she said, looking at the gap. I can't jump that." "Yes, you can," I said. "It's just a big step." "I'll go first. I'll catch you." I backed up, took 2 steps, and leaped. I landed on the neighboring roof with a grunt, my boots skidding on the loose gravel. I turned and held out my arms. "Come on, Sarah, don't look down. Look at me." She hesitated, her toes curling over the edge of the parapet. Below us, in the narrow gap between the buildings, I could hear the sounds of the street, the screams, the horns, the wet tearing sounds. "Sarah, please," I said. "We don't have time." She closed her eyes, took a breath, and jumped. She came up short. Her chest hit the edge of the parapet with a sickening thud. Her hands scrambled for purchase on the rough stone coping. Her legs dangled over the abyss. "Elias!" she screamed. I lunged forward. I grabbed her wrists just as her fingers started to slip. Her weight yanked me down, dragging my chest against the gravel. I gritted my teeth, digging the toes of my boots into the tar paper. "I got you," I grunted, straining. "Kick your legs." "Find the wall." She scrabbled against the brickwork, her shoes scraping for a foothold. I pulled, my shoulders burning. Slowly, inch by inch, I dragged her over the edge. She tumbled onto the roof on top of me, sobbing, clutching my shirt. We lay there for a moment, tangled together on the hot roof, breathing hard. "I'm sorry," she wept. "I'm so sorry. I'm useless." "You're alive," I said, pushing myself up. "That's all that matters. You made the jump." "That's not useless." I helped her up. She was bruising already, a dark mark forming on her cheek where she'd hit the stone, but nothing looked broken. We kept moving. We crossed 3 more rooftops without incident, navigating the maze of skylights, satellite dishes, and pigeon coops. It was a bizarre, surreal journey. Up here, the sky was blue, the pigeons were roosting, the laundry was drying on lines. It was a separate world from the slaughterhouse below. But the illusion of safety shattered when we reached the end of the block. The next building was a commercial warehouse, converted into lofts. It was higher than us, a sheer brick wall rising 20 feet up. There was no way to climb it. To our left was the street. To our right was a courtyard filled with trash. "We have to go through," I said, pointing to a roof access door on the building we were standing on. "We go down a floor, cross the building, and try to find a fire escape on the other side." The door was locked. A heavy steel padlock secured the hasp. I looked around for a tool, a brick, a pipe. Nothing. "Stand back," I said. I raised my boot and kicked the door right next to the latch. The wood splintered, but held. I kicked again and again. On the 4th kick, the frame gave way and the door swung open into darkness. The smell of the building hit us instantly. Old cooking oil, dust, and cat litter. It was the smell of 1,000 New York apartment buildings. We stepped into the stairwell. It was dim, lit only by a dirty skylight above. I held the brass key raised, listening. Silence. Quietly, I whispered. We descended the stairs. The fourth-floor landing was empty. A tricycle sat outside one of the apartment doors. A recycling bin was overflowing with newspapers. It was aggressively normal. We moved down the hall. I wanted to get to the fire escape on the front of the building. We tried the window at the end of the hall, locked. Painted shut with layers of thick white latex. Damn it, I hissed. I tried to force it, but the wood wouldn't budge. Elias, Sarah whispered. She was pointing at one of the apartment doors. It was ajar, just a crack. We can go through the apartment, she said. Use their window. I hesitated. Entering a stranger's home felt like crossing a line. It felt like looting. But the rules had changed. The only rule now was survival. I pushed the door open with the toe of my boot. The apartment was a time capsule of that morning. A coffee cup sat on the entry table, half full. A pair of running shoes were kicked off by the rug. The TV was on in the living room, playing a cartoon on mute. A coyote was chasing a roadrunner across the screen, falling off a cliff over and over again. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is anyone here?" No answer. We stepped inside. The floorboards creaked. I moved toward the living room, my eyes scanning the corners. A cat watched us from the top of a bookshelf, its tail twitching. It hissed at me, then bolted under the sofa. "The window," Sarah said, moving toward the front of the apartment. "It opens onto the fire escape." I followed her, but something caught my eye in the kitchen. The refrigerator door was open. A carton of milk had been dropped on the floor, spilling a white puddle that was slowly spreading across the tiles. And in the middle of the puddle was a footprint, a bloody bare footprint. "Sarah, wait," I said. A sound came from the bedroom, a wet, rhythmic slapping sound, like someone dropping a wet towel on the floor, over and over. Sarah froze, her hand on the window latch. I moved toward the bedroom door. I knew I should just leave. I knew we should go out the window and never look back. But instinct is a hard thing to break. I needed to know what was in the room. I needed to know if it was a threat. I peeked around the doorframe. The bedroom was a wreck. The dresser had been overturned. The mirror was shattered. And on the bed, a man was sitting on the edge of the mattress. He was shirtless, wearing pajama bottoms. He was hunched over, his back to me. He was rocking back and forth. Slap. 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 He was hitting himself. He was slapping his own head with his hands. "Sir?" I whispered. He stopped rocking. He slowly turned his head. Half his face was gone. It looked like he had taken a shotgun blast to the jaw, but there was no gun. Just ragged, torn flesh. His tongue lolled out of the side of his ruined mouth. He saw me. He didn't moan. He didn't scream. He just slid off the bed. He hit the floor with a heavy thud and started crawling toward me. He was fast, inhumanly fast. His elbows and knees worked like pistons. "Go," I shouted at Sarah. "Open the window." I slammed the bedroom door shut. The man hit it a second later. Thud. He started scratching at the wood. Fast, frantic scratching. Then he started slamming his head against it. Bang. 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 Sarah had the window open. The noise of the street flooded in sirens, screams, chaos. "Come on," she yelled, climbing out onto the metal grate of the fire escape. I backed away from the bedroom door. The wood was splintering. I could see gray fingers working through the crack I had made. I turned and ran for the window. I scrambled out onto the fire escape and slid the window shut behind me. Inside the apartment, the bedroom door burst open. The crawler spilled out into the living room. He saw us through the glass. He scrambled over the sofa, knocking over the coffee table. He threw himself at the window. The glass shattered. His hands reached through the broken pane, clawing at the air inches from my face. He didn't care about the jagged glass slicing his wrists. He just wanted to feed. "Down!" I yelled. "Go down!" We scrambled down the fire escape. The metal rattled and shook under our weight. We descended past the third floor, the second floor. We reached the bottom. The drop ladder was stuck. Rusted in place. We were 10 feet above the sidewalk. Below us, the street was a river of gray. We had come down on a side street, not the main avenue, but it was still choked with infected. They were wandering aimlessly, bumping into cars, stumbling over bodies. There were hundreds of them. "We can't go down there," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll tear us apart." I looked back up the fire escape. The crawler was squeezing himself through the broken window. He tumbled out, falling onto the metal landing with a clang. He started dragging himself down the stairs, trailing blood. We were pinched. Death above, death below. I looked across the street. A delivery truck was parked directly underneath the fire escape of the opposite building. If we could get to that truck. "We have to jump," I said. "Not again," Sarah whimpered. "Please, not again." "No, not across. Down. To the dumpster." Directly below our fire escape was a large green commercial dumpster. The lid was closed. It was maybe an 8-foot drop. "I'll go first," I said. "I'll clear it." I swung my legs over the railing. I hung by my hands for a second, aiming my feet. I let go. I hit the plastic lid of the dumpster hard. It buckled, but held. The sound was like a gunshot, a hollow boom that echoed down the street. Every head in the street turned. 50 gray faces snapped toward me. 50 pairs of milky eyes locked onto the noise. "Oh no," I breathed. The moan started. It began as a low ripple and swelled into a roar. They started moving. A slow, shuffling tide turning into a sprint. "Sarah, jump!" I screamed. "Jump now." She hesitated. The crawler was on the landing above her, reaching through the railing. She screamed and jumped. She landed awkwardly on the dumpster lid next to me, slipping on the slick plastic. She tumbled off the side, fallen onto the pavement. "Sarah!" I scrambled off the dumpster. She was on the ground, clutching her ankle. "I twisted it," she gasped. "I can't." "It hurts." The horde was 30 feet away, 20. I could see the hunger in their faces. I could smell the rot coming off them in waves. I grabbed Sarah by the back of her jacket and hauled her up. "You don't have to walk," I grunted, wrapping her arm around my shoulder. "You just have to move." I dragged her toward the delivery truck. It was a box truck. The rear door rolled up. "Inside!" I shoved her into the back of the truck. I vaulted in after her and grabbed the strap of the roll-up door. An infected man in a business suit lunged at the bumper. His fingers brushed the sole of my boot. I yanked the door down. It slammed shut with a heavy metallic rattle. The latch clicked. Darkness. Absolute pitch blackness. Then came the impact. Thud. 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 Bodies slamming against the metal door. Scratching. Hissing. The truck rocked on its suspension as they swarmed it. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dusty air of the cargo hold. The truck was full of flowers, racks and racks of bouquets, roses, lilies, carnations. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, cloying perfume that masked the stench of the dead outside. Sarah was sitting against the wall of the truck, clutching her ankle. She was shaking uncontrollably. "We're trapped," she whispered. "We're just boxed in. We're safe for a minute," I said, though I didn't believe it. "They can't get in." I moved to the front of the cargo area. There was a sliding door leading to the cab. I tried it. Unlocked. I slid it open and peeked into the cab, empty. The keys were gone. I looked out the windshield. The street in front of the truck was a sea of gray. They were swarming over the hood, pounding on the glass. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. It wouldn't hold forever. But beyond the swarm, I saw something. We were on 16th Street, facing west. At the end of the block, across 7th Avenue, there was a barricade. Concrete barriers, razor wire, sandbags. And behind it, soldiers. Real soldiers. National Guard. They had a Humvee with a mounted machine gun. "Sarah," I hissed. "Look." I pointed through the cracked windshield. "The military," she breathed. "They're right there. We have to get to them," I said. "It's 2 blocks. Through that?" She gestured at the swarm on the hood. "No," I said. "We drive." I checked the ignition again. No keys. But this was a fleet truck, an old Ford. I knew these trucks. I'd hot-wired a dozen of them in my youth, back before I got the transit job, back when I was a different kind of person. I dropped under the steering column. I pulled my utility knife from my belt and slashed the plastic casing. I found the wires. Red to red, twist, spark. The engine coughed. The infected on the hood went crazy. They started hammering harder, cracking the glass. "Come on," I growled. "Come on, you piece of junk." I touched the starter wire. The engine roared to life. The truck shuddered. I scrambled into the driver's seat. Sarah pulled herself into the passenger seat. "Buckle up," I said. I threw the truck into drive and floored the gas. The truck lurched forward. We hit the infected in front of us with a sickening thump crunch. Bodies went under the wheels. The truck bounced, tires spinning on slick gore, then caught traction. We plowed through the crowd. It was like driving through a snowdrift if the snow was made of meat and bone. The windshield shattered completely, showering us in safety glass. An arm flailed through the opening, grabbing at the steering wheel. I batted it away with the brass key. We burst out of the side street onto 7th Avenue. The avenue was a war zone, burning cars, overturned buses. But the path to the barricade was clear. I laid on the horn. "Friendly! Friendly coming in!" The soldiers at the barricade raised their weapons. "Don't shoot!" I screamed, waving my hand out the broken window. They didn't shoot. They waved us forward. I slammed on the brakes, skidding the truck sideways to a stop 10 feet from the concrete barriers. "Get out!" a soldier shouted. "Hands up!" "Get out now!" I kicked the door open. I ran around to the passenger's side and pulled Sarah out. We hobbled toward the barricade, hands raised. "Check 'em!" a sergeant barked. "Check for bites." 2 soldiers grabbed us, throwing us against the sandbags. Rough hands patted me down, checked my neck, my arms. "Clean!" the soldier yelled. "Clean!" the other one shouted, checking Sarah. We collapsed behind the barricade. I gasped for air, staring up at the sky. We made it. We actually made it. "Here," a medic said, kneeling beside Sarah. He started cutting the pant leg of her jeans to check her ankle. I looked around. There were about 20 soldiers holding the intersection. They looked terrified. Their eyes were wide, darting everywhere. They were young kids mostly, weekend warriors thrown into the apocalypse. "What's the situation?" I asked the sergeant. He was a thick-necked guy with a cigar stub chewed to pulp in his mouth. "Situation is foobar," he spat. "We're holding the line until 1400. Then we pull back." "Pull back to where?" I asked. "The river," he said. "Evacuation boats at Chelsea Piers." "That's where we were heading," I said. "Well, you better hope there's room," he grunted. "Because after 1400, nothing leaves this island. They're blowing the tunnels." "Blowing them?" I stared at him. "You mean collapsing them?" "I mean sealing them. Permanently." A radio crackled on his vest. "Command to Alpha 6. Be advised. The horde from Union Square has broken containment. They are heading your way. Estimated strength, 2,000 plus." The sergeant went pale. 2,000? He looked down the avenue. In the distance, the smoke swirled, and out of the smoke came a sound, a low, rumbling roar, like a stadium cheering a touchdown, but it wasn't cheering. It was screaming, the street filled with them, wall to wall, a tsunami of gray flesh sprinting toward us. "Open fire!" the sergeant screamed. "Free fire! Light them up!" The 5.0 caliber machine gun on the Humvee opened up. Thump, 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 thump. The sound was deafening. The rounds tore into the front rank of the horde, turning bodies into pink mist. But they didn't stop. They just climbed over the fallen. "We can't hold this," I yelled at the sergeant. "There's too many. Hold the line," he screamed. I grabbed Sarah. The medic had wrapped her ankle. "Can you run?" I asked. I think so." "We aren't staying here," I said. "This position is dead." "What about them?" She pointed at the soldiers. "They're dead too," I said. "They just don't know it yet." I looked west, toward the river, toward the only way out. "We run," I said. "We run for the water, and we don't look back." The machine gun jammed. The horde hit the barricade. The screaming started all over again. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran into the smoke, leaving the soldiers to die behind us. The math of survival was simple, and it was cruel. 2 equals 0, but 2-0 meant we had a chance. The screaming behind us didn't fade. It just changed texture. It went from the sharp-barked orders of men trying to hold a line to the wet, chaotic shrieking of men being torn apart. The heavy thump-thump-thump of the 50 caliber machine gun stuttered, fired a frantic, continuous burst that sounded like a chainsaw ripping through sheet metal, and then fell silent. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. I knew the math. 20 soldiers, 2,000 infected. The equation always ended in zero. "Keep moving," I gasped. My hand clamped around Sarah's wrist so tight, I could feel her pulse hammering against my palm like a trapped bird. "Don't stop. Don't look." We were sprinting down 16th Street, heading west into the meatpacking district. The air here was thick with a different kind of smoke, the greasy, heavy smell of burning restaurants. The high-end steakhouses and bistros that lined these cobblestone streets were turning into ovens. Sarah stumbled, a cry of pain tearing from her throat. Her wrapped ankle clipped the curb, and she went down hard, her knees slamming into the granite pavers. "I can't," she sobbed, curling into a ball. "Elias, I can't running anymore. Just leave me." I grabbed her jacket and hauled her up, ignoring her cry of protest. "I am not leaving you. You hear me? We are not doing that." I looked around. We were in a canyon of brick warehouses converted into luxury lofts and fashion boutiques. To our right, the High Line, that elevated park built on old rail tracks, loomed overhead. I saw shapes falling from the edge of it. Bodies, some flailing, some limp. The park was a trap, a long and narrow kill box with no way out. People were jumping 40 feet to the street rather than face whatever was hunting them up there. One of the jumpers hit the awning of a cafe a few yards away, tearing through the canvas and smashing onto an outdoor table. He lay there for a second, a broken ruin of a man in a jogging suit. Then he started to twitch. His neck snapped back with a sickening crack, and he tried to stand up on legs that were shattered at the shins. "Move," I hissed, dragging Sarah forward. We reached 10th Avenue. The intersection was a graveyard of yellow taxis. They were piled up in a massive knot, their horns blaring a continuous, discordant note that vibrated in my teeth. And in the spaces between the cars, they were waiting. Dozens of them. They were feeding on the drivers trapped inside the gridlock. I saw a man in a UPS uniform smashing a windshield with a tire iron, not to escape, but to get at the woman screaming inside. "Quiet," I whispered, pulling Sarah behind a delivery van. "Stay low." We wove through the maze of metal. I kept the brass reverser key raised, my muscles coiled tight. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every reflection in a car window looked like a lunging monster. We passed a station wagon. The windows were rolled up. Inside, a family mother, father, 2 kids in the back sat, perfectly still. They were staring straight ahead. They weren't dead. They were catatonic. The father's hands were on the wheel, white-knuckled. He saw me. His eyes flicked to mine. He mouthed a single word, "Help." I hesitated. I looked at the door handle. It was locked. I looked at the sea of gray shapes swarming over a bus half a block away. If I broke the glass, the noise would draw them. If I tried to get them out, we would be slowed down. 4 people, 2 kids. I looked at Sarah, limping, her face gray with shock. 220. I looked away from the father. I kept walking. I heard him start screaming as we passed, pounding on the glass, begging me to come back. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat and focused on the river. Just get to the river. We hit the West Side Highway. I stopped. The breath left my lungs in a rush. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. I had expected traffic. I had expected chaos. I hadn't expected a wall. The highway was a solid glacier of steel and flesh, 6 lanes of traffic, bumper to bumper, stretching as far north and south as I could see. And swarming over the cars, like ants on a discarded candy bar, were the infected, thousands of them. They were moving south, a migration of death flowing toward the Battery. We couldn't cross. It was impossible. To step onto that highway was suicide. Beyond the highway, through the gaps in the horde, I could see the piers. I could see the water. The Hudson River was gray and choppy, and there were boats. Ferries, tugs, police launches. They were pulling away from the docks. "They're leaving," Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. "Elias, they're leaving." I checked my watch. 13:42. 18 minutes until the tunnel blowout. 18 minutes until the island was sealed. "We need elevation," I said. scanning the buildings along the highway. We need to get over the highway. A sky bridge, a walkway. I saw it. 2 blocks north. Chelsea Piers. There was a pedestrian bridge crossing over the highway, connecting the city to the sports complex on the pier. There, I pointed. The overpass. It's too far, Sarah said, leaning heavily against a light pole. I can't run that far. We aren't running, I said. We're hiding. The horde on the highway was starting to spill over the median. They were sensing the fresh meat on the side streets. A group of them, 10, maybe 20, broke away from the main pack and started sniffing the air in our direction. I looked to my right, a parking garage. A massive concrete structure rising 10 stories high. The gate was bent inward, stuck halfway open. Inside, I said. We go up. We cross to the next building. Maybe we can get to the bridge from the roof. It was a desperate plan. It was barely a plan at all. But standing on the street corner was a death sentence. We slipped under the broken gate. The garage was dark. The power was out. The only light came from the ramps, slicing through the gloom in dusty beams. The air was cold and smelled of gasoline and old concrete. It was quiet. Too quiet. Stay against the wall, I whispered. We moved up the ramp to the second level. Cars were parked in rows, silent and dusty. I scanned the shadows, my ears straining for that telltale wet breathing, that clicking of teeth. Nothing. Just the distant roar of the city outside. We reached the third level. Sarah was dragging her foot now, her breath coming in ragged hitches. I need to sit, she gasped. Just for a second. Not here, I said. Higher. We turned the corner toward the fourth level ramp, and we froze. In the middle of the ramp, illuminated by a shaft of light from a ventilation grate, stood a man. He was wearing a security guard uniform. He was facing away from us, standing perfectly still. His arms were hanging at his sides, limp. I pulled Sarah back into the shadows of a concrete pillar. The guard didn't move. He was like a statue. Then, a sound echoed through the garage. A car alarm chirped somewhere on the levels above us. Whoop whoop, the guard's head snapped up. It was a mechanical, instant movement. He turned toward the sound. Then he screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a signal. A high, piercing shriek that echoed off the concrete walls. From the darkness of the third level, voices answered. Dozens of them. Shrieks, moans, growls. They were in here. They were sleeping, and we had just walked into their bedroom. Run, I said. Up, go up. We abandoned stealth. We sprinted up the ramp. The guard saw us. He hissed, his jaw unhinging, and charged. I didn't stop. I met his charge with the brass key. I swung it like a baseball bat, putting my entire body weight into the blow. It connected with his temple. He went down, sliding across the concrete. But behind him, the shadows were coming alive. Gray shapes were pouring out from between the parked cars. They were scrambling over hoods, sliding under chassis. They were fast, faster than us. Level 4, I shouted. Keep going. We hit the 4th level. More cars, more shadows moving. There, Sarah pointed. A stairwell door, asterisk, roof, excessive. We ran for it. I could hear the slap of bare feet on concrete behind us, the wet rasp of breathing. I hit the push bar on the door. It was locked. No! I slammed my shoulder against it. It didn't budge. Open. Damn you, open, I kicked it. The metal boomed, but the lock held. Sarah screamed. I spun around. They were coming up the ramp, a pack of them. 5 in the lead, dozens behind. They were tripping over each other in their haste to get to us. The car! I yelled. There was a black SUV parked near the door. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed the driver's side window. I unlocked the door and shoved Sarah inside. I dove in after her and locked the doors. A split second later, they hit the car. Thud, thud, crash. Bodies slammed against the metal, fists pounded on the glass, faces pressed against the windows, smearing blood and saliva. Keys. I frantically checked the ignition. Empty. I checked the visor. Nothing. They're going to break the glass, Sarah whimpered, curling into the passenger footwell. I looked at the windshield. A spiderweb crack was already forming where an infected woman was hammering on it with a piece of pipe. We were trapped in a steel cage, surrounded by a sea of monsters. "Think, Elias," I whispered, my hands shaking. "Think." I looked around the car. It was a luxury model. Leather seats. Sunroof. Sunroof. I looked up. The garage ceiling was low here, maybe 3 feet above the car roof. Running along the ceiling were pipes. Sprinkler pipes, heavy red iron pipes. "Sarah," I said, "can you stand?" "What?" "The sunroof. We have to go up." I hit the button for the sunroof. Nothing happened. The battery was dead. Damn it! I lay on my back and kicked the glass of the sunroof. It was tempered, tough. I kicked again, and again. The glass shattered, raining down on us. "I'm going to boost you," I said. "Grab the pipes. Pull yourself up. There's a ledge above the stairwell door." "I can't," she sobbed. "My ankle." "You have to," I screamed at her, grabbing her shoulders. "Look at them. Look at what they want to do to us. You have to climb." The side window shattered. A hand reached in, grabbing my shoulder. Fingernails dug into my flesh. I spun and stabbed the hand with my utility knife. The blade sank into the gray wrist. The thing didn't let go. I slashed, severing the tendons. The hand went limp. "Go," I shouted. I cupped my hands. Sarah stepped into them. I heaved her upward. She grabbed the sprinkler pipe. She screamed in pain as her weight hung on her arms, but she swung her legs up, hooking them over the pipe. She shimmied along the red iron until she reached the concrete ledge above the stairwell door. "I made it," she yelled down. The infected were climbing onto the car. The roof buckled under their weight. I stood on the center console. I reached for the pipe. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down. An infected man had crawled through the broken window. He was in the back seat. He was lunging for me. I kicked him in the face, my boot crunching his nose. He fell back, but another one was crawling in behind him. I jumped. My hands closed around the cold, rusty iron of the pipe. I swung my legs up, kicking at the faces below me. Teeth snapped inches from my boots. I pulled myself up, hand over hand, straining against gravity. My muscles burned. My breath came in ragged gasps. I reached the ledge and rolled onto it, collapsing beside Sarah. We were 10 feet up, perched on a concrete lip above the doorframe. Below us, the car was disappearing under a mound of gray bodies. They were tearing at the upholstery, tearing at the metal, furious that their meal had vanished. "Where now?" Sarah whispered. I looked around. The ledge ran along the wall. It led to a ventilation duct, a large, industrial louvered vent. "The vent," I said. "If we can get it open, it might lead to the roof." We crawled along the ledge. The sounds of the horde below were deafening, a cacophony of frustration and hunger. I reached the vent. It was screwed shut. I pulled out my utility knife. The tip was broken from stabbing the hand, but the screwdriver bit on the handle was intact. "Hold the light," I told Sarah, handing her my flashlight. I worked the screws. They were rusted, painted over. My hands were slick with sweat and blood. One screw, two. The metal grate groaned. Below us, the infected were starting to look up. They were sniffing the air. They were piling on top of the car, building a pyramid of bodies to reach us. "Hurry," Sarah breathed. Third screw. Fourth, the grate came loose. I shoved it inward. It fell into the duct with a clang. "Inside," I said. We squeezed into the dark, dusty tunnel. I pulled the grate back into place, wedging it as best I could. We crawled. The duct was tight, claustrophobic. It smelled of ancient dust and dead rats. We crawled for what felt like miles, but was probably only 50 feet. The sound of the garage faded, replaced by the humming of our own blood in our ears. Finally, I saw light ahead, a roof vent. I pushed the cover open. Fresh air. Smoke-filled, acrid, but fresh. I climbed out. I pulled Sarah up. We were on the roof of the parking garage. 10 stories up. The wind whipped at us. I ran to the edge. We were right next to the West Side Highway. The river of cars and bodies was directly below us. And beyond it, the pier. Chelsea Piers was chaos. The boats were pulling away. The last ferry was 50 yards out into the dark water. People were jumping off the docks, swimming after it. "They're gone," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "We missed them." I looked at the water. The evacuation was over. The 1400 deadline was minutes away. Then I saw it. A tugboat. It was moored at a maintenance dock, separate from the main terminal. It wasn't moving. There were no people swarming it. There, I pointed. That tug. It's across the highway, Sarah said. And the water. I looked at the gap. The parking garage was separated from the pier building by the highway. It was a 60-foot drop to the infected below. But there was a crane. A construction crane was positioned on the roof of the building next to us, a luxury condo tower still under construction. The boom of the crane stretched out over the highway, hovering above the roof of the pier building. The crane, I said. We can walk across the boom. Walk across? Sarah looked at the crane. It was a skeleton of steel, swaying slightly in the wind. Elias, I can barely walk on the ground. It's the only way, I said. We crossed the crane, drop onto the pier roof, and get to that boat. We ran to the edge of the garage roof where it touched the condo tower. There was a gap of about 4 feet. I jumped it easily. I turned and helped Sarah across. She landed with a cry, clutching her ankle. It's broken, she gasped. I know it's broken. I'll carry you, I said. You can't carry me across a crane. Watch me. We climbed the scaffolding on the side of the condo tower to reach the crane base. The city spread out below us, a burning map of devastation. I looked at the crane operator's cab. It was empty. The door swung in the wind. We climbed the ladder to the boom. The walkway was narrow, a steel mesh grate with a single handrail. Okay, I said. I'm going to go first. You hold on to my belt. We go slow, one step at a time. We started out. The wind howled through the steel lattice. Below us, the highway was a river of gray ants. If we fell, we would be eaten before we hit the ground. We were halfway across when the explosion happened. A deep, subterranean thump that shook the entire world. I looked east. A plume of dust and debris shot into the sky from the middle of 7th Avenue, then another from 8th, then 9th. The tunnels, I whispered. They're blowing the tunnels. The shockwave hit us. A second later, the crane lurched. The steel groaned. Sarah screamed, losing her footing. She slipped, her legs dangling over the edge of the walkway. Sarah! I lunged, grabbing her jacket. The crane swayed violently. The boom dipped. Hold on! I roared, wrapping my arm around the handrail. We hung there, suspended over the apocalypse, as the city detonated around us. The sound of the explosions rolled over us like thunder, a final, definitive period at the end of the sentence that was New York City. The crane stabilized, but it was listing. The base had been damaged by the shockwave. Pull yourself up, I gritted my teeth, hauling Sarah back onto the grate. She scrambled up, her face white, her eyes wide with terror. The boat, I said, pointing. The tugboat was still there. But figures were moving on the dock. Gray figures. They had found the pier. We have to hurry, I said. Before they find the boat. We scrambled the rest of the way across the boom. We reached the end, hovering over the flat roof of the pier building. It was a 10-foot drop. Jump, I said. We jumped. We hit the roof hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Sarah screamed again, passing out from the pain in her ankle. I stood up, chest heaving. I picked her up, slinging her over my shoulder in a fireman's carry. I ran across the roof toward the ladder that led down to the maintenance dock. I reached the edge and looked down. The dock was swarming. 50, maybe 60 infected were milling around the gangway of the tugboat, and on the deck of the tug, a man was standing with a shotgun. He was yelling at them, firing into the crowd. Get back! Get back! He was one man. They were legion. I looked around the roof for a weapon. A brick. A pipe. Anything. I saw a heavy coil of steel cable. I looked at the man on the boat. He was reloading. He fumbled a shell. An infected leaped from the dock to the deck. The man swung the shotgun, clubbing the thing off the boat. Hey! I screamed. Hey, look up! The man looked up. He saw me. He saw Sarah on my shoulder. Help us, I yelled. He looked at the horde on the dock. He looked at us. He looked at the water. He shook his head. I can't. They're everywhere. We're clean, I screamed. We're clean. Let us on. He hesitated. Then, the door to the roof access behind me burst open. I spun around. They were on the roof. They had climbed the crane. They had followed us, a dozen of them. Sprinting across the tar paper, I looked at the drop to the water. 30 feet. I looked at the boat. I looked at the horde coming for us. Math, I whispered. I grabbed Sarah tighter. Sorry, I said to her unconscious form. I ran for the edge of the roof, not toward the ladder, toward the water. I leaped. For a second, we were flying. The air rushed past my ears. The gray water rushed up to meet us. We hit the Hudson with a bone-jarring splash. The cold seized my chest. The darkness swallowed us. I kicked, fighting the weight of my boots, fighting the weight of Sarah. I broke the surface, gasping. The current was strong. It pulled us away from the pier. I looked up. The infected were pouring off the roof, diving into the water after us like lemmings. And on the tugboat, the engine roared to life. "Wait!" I screamed, spitting water. "Wait!" The boat began to pull away, churning the water into white foam. We were floating in the freezing river, surrounded by drowning monsters, watching our last hope steam away into the smoke-choked afternoon. Then, the boat slowed. It turned. The man on the deck threw something, a life ring attached to a yellow rope. It landed 10 feet away. "Grab it!" he screamed. "Grab it or die!" I kicked. I dragged Sarah. An infected surface next to me, clawing at my face. I shoved it under, feeling its fingers rake my scalp. I reached the ring. I hooked my arm through it. I grabbed Sarah's belt. "Go!" I yelled. The rope went taut. We were yanked through the water, dragging behind the boat like bait on a hook. I looked back at the city. The tunnel explosions had triggered a collapse. A massive cloud of dust was rolling down the avenues, swallowing the buildings. The island was disappearing. Manhattan was gone. But we were moving. We were leaving. I closed my eyes and held on, listening to the roar of the engine and the silence of the world ending behind us. The water of the Hudson River wasn't just cold. It was a physical blow, a sledgehammer of ice that drove the air from my lungs and seized my muscles in a rigid, shivering paralysis. The shock was absolute. For a second, I didn't know which way was up. I was just a consciousness suspended in a dark, freezing void, tumbling through the currents of a dying city. Then the rope jerked. It yanked my arm, nearly dislocating my shoulder, and dragged me upward. I broke the surface, gasping, sucking in a mouthful of oily, brackish water and smoke. I coughed, retching, flailing my free arm to find Sarah. "Sarah!" I screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the tugboat's engine. I felt a weight on the belt loop I was gripping. She was there. She was dead weight, dragging behind me like an anchor, her head lolling back into the gray chot of the wake. "Hold on!" I yelled, though I knew she couldn't hear me. Just hold on. The tugboat was moving, churning the water into a white, frothy violence. We were being trolled behind it, skipping over the waves. The friction of the water tore at my clothes. The cold began to bite deeper, turning my skin numb, then burning, then numb again. I looked back. The water behind us was alive. The infected who had jumped from the pier were surfacing. They weren't swimming. They were thrashing, driven by a motor function that didn't understand buoyancy or drowning. Heads bobbed in the dark swells, pale gray faces with black mouths gasping for air they didn't need. Hands clawed at the surface, reaching for us. One of them, a man in a sodden construction vest, caught a wave and surged forward. His hand slapped the water inches from Sarah's boot. He went under, then resurfaced closer. His eyes locked on us with that terrible, empty focus. "Faster!" I screamed at the boat, kicking my legs, trying to put distance between us and the swarm. "Go all faster!" The man on the deck was reeling us in. He was working a winch, his muscles straining against his flannel shirt. He wasn't looking at us. He was watching the water, scanning for the things trying to board his vessel. He hauled us to the stern. The metal hull loomed over me, slick with algae and rust. A tire bumper hung down, swaying. "Grab the tire," the man shouted. His voice was raw, gravelly. "Climb." I reached out, my fingers stiff and clumsy. I hooked my arm through the tire. I tried to pull myself up, but the weight of Sarah and the drag of the water were too much. I was exhausted. My reserves were gone. I had run, fought, and climbed for hours. I had nothing left. I can't," I choked out. "I can't lift her." the man cursed. He abandoned the winch and ran to the rail. He leaned over, a gaff hook in his hand. "Hook her belt," he roared. I fumbled underwater, finding the back of Sarah's belt. I lifted her as best I could, treading water with legs that felt like lead. The man swung the gaff. The steel hook caught her waistband. "Let go," he yelled. I released her. He hauled her up, dragging her over the gunwale like a wet sack of flour. She flopped onto the steel deck, motionless. "Now you." He reached down with a hand that felt like a vice. He grabbed my wrist and pulled. I scrambled up the tire, my boots slipping on the wet rubber. He yanked me over the rail, and I collapsed onto the deck next to Sarah, coughing up river water. I lay there for a moment, pressing my cheek against the cold steel plating. The vibration of the engine hummed through my skull. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Get up," the man said. I looked up. He was standing over us, a pump-action shotgun leveled at my chest. He was older, maybe 60, with a face carved from granite and a beard stained with tobacco juice. He wore a dirty captain's hat and a life vest that had seen better decades. "Check her," he ordered, gesturing to Sarah with the barrel of the gun. "Check for bites. If she's bit, she goes back in. Right now." "Shh. She's not bit," I wheezed, pushing myself to my knees. "She broke her ankle, that's all." "Check her," he barked, racking the slide of the shotgun. Chunk. I crawled over to Sarah. She was unconscious, her skin pale and waxy. Her lips were blue. Hypothermia was setting in fast. I rolled her over, checking her neck, her arms, her torso. I pulled up her pant legs. Her left ankle was swollen, purple and black, the shape of it wrong, but the skin wasn't broken. There were no teeth marks, no black veins. "She's clean," I said, looking up at him. "I swear to God, she's clean. And you?" I held up my arms. I pulled up my shirt. I showed him my neck. "Clean." The captain stared at me for a long, agonizing second. He was doing the math. 2 refugees, 1 injured. Limited supplies, the world ending. He lowered the shotgun. "There's blankets in the wheelhouse," he grunted. "Get her warm. If she turns, I kill both of you." No hesitation. "Understood," I whispered. I picked Sarah up. She felt lighter than before, frail. I carried her into the small cabin. It smelled of stale coffee, diesel, and pipe tobacco. It was warm. I laid her on a bench seat and wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket. I stripped off my own soaking wet jacket and found a tarp to drape over myself. I looked out the rear window of the wheelhouse. We were in the middle of the Hudson, heading south. And behind us, Manhattan was gone. The dust cloud from the tunnel explosions had swallowed the island. It was a wall of gray, rolling down the avenues, consuming the skyscrapers. The tops of the buildings poked out of the smog like tombstones in a graveyard. The fires from the burning cars and buildings cast a hellish orange glow through the haze. I couldn't hear the screaming anymore. I couldn't hear the sirens. There was just the drone of the engine and the slap of the water against the hull. The city I had lived in my whole life, the city I had memorized track by track, station by station, was dead. The number 4 line was a tomb. The passengers I had carried that morning were either monsters or meat. I sank onto the floor of the cabin, my back against the wall, and I wept. I didn't make a sound. I just let the tears mix with the river water on my face. I cried for the family in the station wagon. I cried for the soldiers at the barricade. I cried for the man I killed with the brass key. The brass key. I looked at my hand. My fingers were curled into a rigid claw. I was still holding it. The reverser key. The tool of my trade. It was dented, scratched, and stained with the black blood of the infected. I stared at it. It was a piece of the old world, a symbol of a job that didn't exist anymore. The captain stepped into the wheelhouse. He looked at me, then at the key. "You a driver?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "Train operator," I said, my voice cracking. "Number 4 line." He nodded. He moved to the helm, adjusting the throttle. "I'm Sully. This is the Martha J." "Elias," I said. "This is Sarah." "Where we headed, Elias?" Sully asked, looking out at the gray water. "Because I got bad news. Jersey isn't any better. I've been listening to the radio. Newark is gone. Hoboken is gone. The whole seaboard is lighting up. Is there anywhere? I asked. Anywhere safe? Sully tapped the radio console. It was scanning frequencies, buzzing with static. Occasionally a voice would cut through, a frantic plea for help, a military order, a scream. Military is setting up a containment zone at the Bayonne terminal, Sully said. Deep water port, defensible. They got fences, guns, and ships. It's the only place still broadcasting and all clear. Bayonne, I repeated. It was miles south. Can we make it? We got fuel, Sully said. Question is, will they let us in? They're shooting boats that don't follow protocol. We have to try, I said. We can't go back. Sully nodded. He pushed the throttle forward. The Martha J surged, picking up speed. I sat with Sarah for an hour as we steamed south. I rubbed her hands, trying to get the circulation back. She woke up once, disoriented, screaming about the crane. I held her until she calmed down, whispering that we were safe, even though I knew it was a lie. Then, we weren't safe. We were just alive. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the water. To our left, the Statue of Liberty loomed out of the smoke. She looked small against the backdrop of the burning city. There were fires on Liberty Island, too. I saw figures running around the base of the pedestal. I saw bodies falling from the torch. Even the symbols were dying. Approaching the terminal, Sully called out. I stood up and went to the window. Bayonne was a fortress. The military had taken over the container terminal. Massive cargo ships were docked, forming a steel wall. On the shore, I saw tanks, floodlights, and hundreds of soldiers. There was a line of boats waiting to dock, private yachts, fishing trawlers, jet skis, a flotilla of the desperate, and there were gunboats patrolling the perimeter. This is the United States Coast Guard, a voice boomed over a loudspeaker, echoing across the water. Maintain your speed and heading. Prepare to be boarded and inspected. Any deviation will be met with lethal force. I repeat, lethal force. Sully slowed the tug. We drifted into the queue. Get ready, he said. They're gonna check you again, harder this time. If you got so much as a scratch on you, they'll shoot you and dump you in the bay. I looked at Sarah. She was shivering, pale. She looked sick. She's hypothermic, I said. She's not infected. He better hope they see the difference, Sully said grimly. A patrol boat pulled alongside us. It was a rigid hull, inflatable with a mounted machine gun aimed directly at my chest. 3 soldiers in hazmat suits jumped onto our deck. Hands on your heads, one of them shouted, his voice muffled by a gas mask. On your knees. Now. I dropped to my knees on a cold steel. Sully did the same, keeping his hands visible. We have an injured female, I shouted. Broken ankle. Exposure. The soldiers ignored me. One of them moved to Sarah. He grabbed her by the hair, tilting her head back to check her eyes. He shined a flashlight into her pupils. Pupils responsive, he called out. Temperature low. No visible necrosis. He ripped the blanket off her. He checked her arms, her neck. He cut her jeans open to look at the ankle. Trauma consistent with a fall, he said. She's clean. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They checked me next. Rough hands patted me down, checking for hidden bites. They found the brass key in my hand. Drop the weapon, the soldier ordered. I looked at the key. It was heavy, solid. It had saved my life 3 times today. It's a tool, I said. I'm a train operator. Drop it. Now. He raised his rifle. I opened my hand. The brass key hit the deck with a heavy clang. It rolled away, coming to rest in the scuppers. Clear, the soldier said. He keyed his radio. Tug, Martha J, is clear. 3 souls. 1 casualty. Proceed to Dock 4 for processing. The soldiers jumped back onto their boat. They sped away to the next vessel in line. Sully stood up, brushing off his knees. He looked at me. You got lucky, kid, he said. Yeah, I said, staring at the brass key lying in the gutter. Lucky. We docked 10 minutes later. The scene on the pier was organized chaos. Triage tents were set up in rows. Soldiers were separating families, men to the left, women and children to the right. People were crying, begging, screaming. I helped Sarah off the boat. A medic team was waiting with a stretcher. We got her, a medic said, taking Sarah from me. She goes to the trauma tent. I'm staying with her, I said, grabbing the side of a stretcher. Negative, a soldier said, stepping in front of me. He pushed me back with the butt of his rifle. Processing is that way. You'll be reunited once you're cleared. Elias, Sarah cried, reaching for me. I'll find you, I shouted. I promise, Sarah, I'll find you. They wheeled her away. She disappeared into a sea of white tents. I turned back to the boat. Sully was still on deck, tying off a line. You coming? I asked. Sully shook his head. He patted the rail of the tug. This is my home, Elias. They ain't gonna let me keep her if I go in there. They'll commandeer her. Strip her. You can't stay out here, I said. It's freezing. And the water? I'll take my chances on the river, Sully said. I got fuel. I got a gun. I ain't going into no cage. He looked at me, his eyes sad and tired. You did good today, kid. You got her out. That counts. That's the math. Thank you, I said. Good luck, Sully said. He untied the line and pushed off from the dock. I watched the Martha J drift away into the darkness, a small, stubborn shadow against the burning skyline. Move it, the soldier yelled, shoving me toward the processing line. I walked. I shuffled forward with hundreds of other survivors. We were a line of ghosts, covered in dust, blood, and soot. We didn't talk. We didn't look at each other. We just stared ahead at the floodlights. I reached the front of the line. A soldier with a clipboard looked me up and down. Name? Elias, I croaked. Occupation? I hesitated. I thought about the train. I thought about the red signal. I thought about the darkness of the tunnel and the screams of the passengers I couldn't save. Survivor, I said. The soldier didn't blink. He just wrote it down. Zone B, Tent 4. Move. I walked into the camp. It was a prison. High chain-link fences topped with razor wire surrounded us. Patrols with dogs walked the perimeter. Beyond the fence, the lights of New Jersey were going out, one by one, as the grid failed. I found a spot on the concrete floor of a warehouse that had been converted into a barracks. I sat down, pulling my knees to my chest. I was safe. I was alive. But I closed my eyes, and I was back in the tunnel. I heard the thump-thump of the sleepers. I saw the red signal. I saw the face of the teenager pressed against the glass, eating the window. I realized then that Sully was wrong. The math hadn't worked out. I had saved Sarah. I had saved myself, 2 lives. But I had left thousands behind. The passengers on my train. The people in the station. The soldiers at the barricade. The family in the car. 2 minus thousands. The result was a negative number. A debt I could never repay. I reached into my pocket. My hand closed around something cold and metallic. I froze. I pulled it out. It was the brass reverser key. I must have picked it up. Instinct. Muscle memory. When the soldier told me to drop it, I had dropped a piece of metal, a wrench from the deck, maybe. But I had kept the key. I gripped it tight. The metal bit into my palm. It was the only thing I had left, the only thing that made sense. Forward, neutral, reverse. Simple controls for a complex world. I looked up at the ceiling of the warehouse. I could hear the distant boom of artillery fire. The war was just starting. The long night was beginning. I wasn't a train operator anymore. The tracks were gone. The signals were all red. But I was still here. I squeezed the key until my hand shook. Day 1, I whispered to the darkness. And the darkness, filled with the weeping of 1,000 shattered souls, whispered back, Welcome to the new world.